All right. So today, this is going to be, I'm scatterbrained. Confession, I'm scatterbrained. I started up a series last year, I think it was last January in 2024. I was calling it The Fundamentals of Yahweh's Holy Days. And I intended to go through all of them from Passover all the way up to Sukkot and give like a detailed nuts and bolts. This is what it looks like to keep these holy days, and kind of keep it practical, and kind of leave out, the theology, kind of keep that to a minimum, and kind of focus on like, if you choose to keep this feast, how do you do it? What does it look like? And I did Passover, and I did unleavened bread, but the recording for unleavened bread didn't turn out. And I had a lot of people since then ask me for the recording, and I don't have one. And of course, I got sidetracked and never did first fruits. I never did Shavuot. I never did any of the other ones. We having audio issues? Yeah, I'm going to get to this in a second. Yeah. So anyway, I'm kind of starting over again. I'm not doing Passover again. That one's up on YouTube. But I am starting over again with Feast of Unleavened Bread for anybody that missed it last year. And then hopefully I'm going to keep this going, and then we will do the remaining feast days throughout the year as we kind of get up closer. I have here, since we're doing the Feast of Unleavened Bread teaching today, we have handouts for any kids who might want to do these. I will not put a definition on the age of a kid. So if you happen to be a kid with a beard, aka a grown man, you're welcome to do these too. Same for the ladies. But these are little just activities. Did you come up here, Ezra, to hand these out? You came up here. I thought you were just reminding me. Sorry. Ezra's going to hand these out to whoever wants them. But like I said, this is not going to be anything too intensive, but what I'm trying to do is provide a framework for, I think everybody in this room is pretty much on board with keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Otherwise, why are we here? What are we doing? Kind of thing. But just to kind of simplify it and condense it down, because doing this walk for almost 20 years, my wife's done it longer, it seems like every few years somebody comes along with a different perspective and a different set of requirements on how to do this. And I just kind of want to strip it down as bare bones as we can make it, kind of as a starting point. And if you as an individual or you as a family want to go beyond what I'm saying here, that's perfectly fine. I'm trying to kind of set a bedrock of what we're talking about here. So when we deal with leaven, because it is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the first question is, what is leaven? And I'm just going to admit that when I do word studies, I am not a Hebrew or a Greek linguist. I'm not a person who deep dives into the language. I will often go to Strong's. Sometimes I'll go further, but I just don't have the patience, to be honest, to really super deep dive. Others do. That's commendable, but I kind of get bogged down in Strong's. But anyway, so leaven in your Strong's is the word H7603. And it basically means leaven. It's from a root, and the root implies, and this is interesting, the root implies swelling or fermentation. Now, when I go to this root word here in a minute, we're going to have a logical thing we're going to look at that's going to kind of be the underpinning of where we're going to go. So H7603 is the actual word for leaven. Strong's H7604 is the root word for that. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I think it's sha'ar. But basically, that word means to leave behind or to remain. So what does the idea of being left behind or remaining have to do with leaven? Because leaven, like I said earlier, it means to swell or to puff up. And this is where you get this idea. People will take the idea of unleavened bread, because we'll read it here in a minute, you're supposed to remove all the leaven from your house or from your dwelling. The idea is anything that swells or puffs up. Some families, some congregations will take it all the way to like rice, pasta, beans sometimes. Anything that can absorb water and gain volume is considered leavened. And so some congregations will have You can't have pasta, you can't have anything that's fermented as far as like alcoholic products, vinegar, wine, anything like that is a no-go. But when we look at this word, it means to leave behind or remain. So we're just going to kind of go through this logically, and by the time we're done, hopefully I'll connect why I think the word for leaven has the root word for left behind or remaining. I don't mean left behind in the Kirk Cameron sense, like rapture and all that stuff. This is like a remnant kind of thing, not a escape card. So it's the bread of haste. And we'll read this here in Exodus, but I want to give a couple examples of when someone made unleavened bread, because like I said, the purpose of this teaching is to be practical. What does it look like on a practical level, getting your hands dirty, living it? Let's start with our first scripture in Genesis 18. Genesis 18, and we're going to read verses 1 through 8. Genesis 18, 1 through 8. Now Yahweh appeared to him, Abraham, by the oaks of Mamre while he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. When he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, My master, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a piece of bread that you may refresh yourselves. After that you may go on, since you have visited your servant. And they said, So do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, Quickly, prepare 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make bread cakes. Abraham also ran to the herd and took a tender and choice calf and gave it to the servant, and he hurried to prepare it. He took curds and milk and the calf which he had prepared and placed it before them, and he was standing by them under the tree as they ate. So here we've got Sarah, and they have a surprise lunch visitor. Like, just the idea that Yahweh would show up at my house for an impromptu lunch date is astonishing. But this is what life was like for Abraham. But the idea is that because there was no notice, Sarah has to prepare some bread quickly. Okay, this is like a bread of haste kind of idea. Quick, whip something up quickly. And she does the three measures. My instinct is that it's one for each of them, Yahweh, and then the 2 messengers that were with him, but who knows? But the idea is that she was making it quickly. This isn't like I'm going to follow a recipe and then I'm going to let the dough rise for several hours and then I'm going to put it in the oven and cook it and do this whole process, because I see my wife bake and I know it's a process and it always turns out delicious. But it's not something to do bread in the conventional sense. And this is why I'm lumping this in with the unleavened bread, because to do bread in the conventional sense, it takes time. It takes at least a couple hours, start to finish, depending on how you're cooking it and how much and that kind of stuff. But we don't have that time frame here. So to me, it's implied, doesn't spell it out, but it's implied to me that Sarah was probably making unleavened bread just because of the quickness of it, the speed of it. Let's go a couple pages over, Genesis 19. And we're going to read verses 1 through 3. Genesis 19, 1 through 3. Now the 2 angels who had that yummy bread that Sarah made a page back, they came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And he said, Now behold, my masters, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way. They said, however, No, we shall spend the night in the square. Yet he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. So again, we have the idea of surprise visitors. This wasn't scheduled, it wasn't planned. They had to get something together for these guests who showed up spur of the moment. And they specifically did unleavened bread. Now, there is a theory out there that this is a timing indicator, because we know when Yahweh is passing down the covenant to Isaac, one of the conditions he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says basically, your father Abraham kept my laws, my commandments, my statutes, and my ordinances. And of course, we know when we look at the Torah in its sum totality, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, is one of those commanded things. And so the idea is that because this is in the springtime, and because Lot was serving the angels unleavened bread, by default, that means that Lot was observing the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, I personally disagree because I just don't see a setup for that. The way the text reads, when we get into Exodus, that's the first time anyone's keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So unless Lot was doing it accidentally at this point, not knowing what was coming, I don't know. But either way, he's got surprise visitors, he's in a hurry, and he's making them a feast, and part of that feast is unleavened bread. So again, if you ladies, and I guess some of the men, because some of the men cook, right? Let's equal weights and measures here. I know Ezra likes to make cookies these days, but if somebody just shows up at your house and you are going to say, okay, I'm going to make some bread for you guys, and you do the whole 5-hour process or however long it takes, in my opinion, that's kind of rude and inhospitable, especially if you know that they might be hungry, because you want to get food on their plates now. So to me, this is the reason why Lot was serving them unleavened bread. It wasn't because he was keeping some proto-primitive Passover or something. It's because of just the necessity of it, just the logistics of it. He was on a tight time frame, and what do? You make up unleavened bread quickly. So has anybody made unleavened bread from scratch? I see some hands going up. Because it's really easy to buy the store-bought stuff. In my opinion, the store-bought stuff is the bread of affliction. It's like, why don't I just eat this paper? Same kind of idea, right? But with the homemade stuff, you have the opportunity to put some love and attention and care into it, and it turns out delicious usually. Now, my wife is capable of making unleavened bread that's not so tasty if she really wants to, but just by virtue of how awesome she is as a cook, it always turns out amazing. So it's not the bread. I like to say she doesn't make the bread of affliction, she makes the bread of addiction. Because you just can't stop eating it. But anyway, it's a relatively simple process, right? All you're doing is you're taking your raw ingredients, your flour, your water. It's really kind of all you need. Maybe you put some oil in it, maybe you salt it, and then you cook it. That's pretty straightforward. And you can get a little bit more elaborate if you want, and maybe put some extra seasonings and things like that in it, but it's a pretty straightforward process. And so it makes sense to me that that is the bread of choice when it comes to serving a guest quickly. When you have somebody show up on your doorstep unannounced, that's your go-to bread. You don't just say, okay, I'm going to make my exotic French baguette, from scratch for you guys and have you wait however long that process is. So that's the foundation of where we're going to go with that. I see a hand up. We're going to get to that. Yep. Yep. Because they didn't have grocery stores that they could just go down and just buy leaven in the tubs, and they didn't have refrigeration that they could keep the leaven refrigerated like we do today. So their baking process was entirely different than what we're used to in Western culture. Maybe I shouldn't say entirely different, but considerably different. It's not like it was polar opposite. Sure. It can. I've seen videos of people that are pros. They can bang that out in like 10 minutes. Yeah. The butchering and the dressing. Yep. If they know what they're doing, they can bang it out really quick. Now, obviously, if you're roasting it, the cooking process takes some time, but the actual slaughter and the dressing, that can go like that. For somebody, the people that prepare sheep down in Australia and in New Zealand, they'll bang out a whole full-size sheep in like 10 minutes and just have it quartered, the whole bit, drained, everything. Now they don't, obviously in that time, they're not taking the extra steps to like salt it or anything to really draw the blood out and that kind of thing, but they're getting it like done. And of course, that's a skill, but it can be done. But it wouldn't have been like, even with that, even if we grant them more time, when you, and maybe my mileage is different than somebody else's, but every time that I've seen somebody make like actual leavened risen bread, it's like at least a 4 or 5 hour process start to finish, you know? Yeah. Not 10 minutes literally, but yeah, it like a pro could have this done depending on how they're cooking, probably within an hour or two from the time that they kill the livestock until the time that's on the table. Did I hear somebody else?
My mother had company stop. She went out, got a chicken, dispatched it, cleaned it, and within, it was less than an hour, it was served.
Oh yeah. Yep. And you can do chickens pretty quick. We've been butchering our own chickens over the years and getting a little bit better and more efficient at it.
Roast chicken, you cut it into pieces, and then you fry it.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't take long. You work at a butcher shop, you soon find out you can, and it's better out in the scripture where it says that, Esau went out to hunt for deer, and Mama went and got a goat for
Uh-huh.
Jacob, and it was served before he got back. So,
Mm-hmm.
but I think also when they leaven bread, at least in my experience of making it, number one, they didn't have the flours we have now. It was whole grain flour, and at the very best, even if you have yeast, it still doesn't turn out anything like
Mm-hmm.
what we have with high gluten and polished, clean of the hulls and stuff, where you pound it and the mortise and pestle, and you make it like that. It's got a lot of granular fiber.
Mm-hmm.
I think what the text could say in English more appropriately would be the cracker, because that's basically what it boils down to be, is nothing more than water, salt, and you can make them fairly fast. You got a hot oven, you know, it's like saltine.
Mm-hmm.
Now saltines do have a form of leavening in it, but it's not yeast.
Yeah, they'll usually put like baking powder or something.
Cream tartar, vinegar, and baking soda, some sort of something to give you some bubbling.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Civil War bore this out in their hardtack, and that was just a block of flour,
Mm-hmm.
and it was unfortunate it wasn't a cracker.
Well, and that's a good point about the different varieties of wheat. And like, we've also got the modern strains of yeast that we're using today have been bred to be more efficient with carbonization and fermentation in the different whatever you're putting it in, whether it's bread, whether it's beer. So it's a lot different than it would have been back then. Let's go to Exodus 12. We're going to read about the first Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is, like I said, we're trying to focus more on the nuts and bolts here. Exodus 12, we're going to read verses 14 through 20. And like I said, this is specifically more about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the unleavened bread part, than it is the actual Passover meal. They're related, they're connected, but they're not necessarily identical. So Exodus 12, 14 through 20. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to Yahweh throughout your generations. You are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, but on the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats anything leavened from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall have a holy assembly, and another holy assembly on the seventh day. No work at all shall be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. You shall also observe the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for on this very day I brought your hosts out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent ordinance. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel. whether he is a stranger or a native of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your dwellings you shall eat unleavened bread. And we're going to skip down later in the chapter to verse 33 and read verses 33 through 39. The Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead. So the people took their dough, and this is the process here. The people took their dough before it was leavened. Remember, leaven means risen, with their kneading bowls bound up and the clothes on their shoulders. Now the sons of, how far was I going? 39, okay. The sons of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, for they had requested from the Egyptians articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And Yahweh had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have their request. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now the sons of Israel, 30. The sons of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot, about 6,000 men on foot, aside from children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, along with flocks and herds, a very large number of livestock. They baked the dough which they had brought out of Egypt into cakes of unleavened bread, for it had not become leavened, since they were driven out of Egypt and could not delay, nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. So this is kind of a process. And I mentioned earlier, these people were not going down to the grocery store and buying leaven. They weren't storing it in their fridges because they didn't have fridges. Now they did, they did have root cellars in some cases where they could store things like that. But their process of baking was not what we have now. For these people to have leavened bread, everything that I've seen, that I've researched, says that it would have had to have been some form of sourdough. So the idea is like, let's say that I'm making bread and I've got my water and I've got my flour, maybe I added some oil to it or whatever. At that point, it's totally unleavened. The longer I let it sit out, eventually, over time, it will pick up yeast from the air and it will become leavened. And the longer I let that process go on, and the more sugary compounds that are in that wheat for that yeast to eat, the more that will start to rise and whatnot. And so when they've got their bread and they cooked it before it became leavened, just as far as a process goes with what they had available, there's two ways I could see this going about. The first option is it's just the flour, the water, that was it, period. So they just mixed it up, boom, done. The second option is that process, but they had not added sourdough starter to it. Because anybody that does sourdough knows that a sourdough starter, properly maintained, is a member of your family. I've seen grown women cry when their sourdough starter dies. I won't name names, but I've seen it happen. It's a thing. You love and care for that sourdough starter, because sourdough bread, if it's really good, is like the best thing ever. It's superior to any other, in my opinion anyway. It's superior to store-bought. It's superior to plain old white bread. It's amazing. So the idea here, and the reason why I think that this is important, we'll go back to verse 34 here. The people took their dough, okay, so they have dough. They have, at minimum, this flour-water mixture before it was leavened. Okay, so it's in their kneading bowls, and they're leaving. They've got this dough in their kneading bowls, and they're getting out of town. Several days later, whenever this was, in verse 39, then they stop and bake the dough into unleavened bread cakes, okay? And it says, for it had not become leavened since they were driven out of Egypt. And they didn't have time to prepare the provisions for themselves. So just on a practical basis, it looks to me like the idea here is that because you can have sourdough starter that you're not cooking with. If you cook all your sourdough starter, then you have nothing for the next batch. So if you remember earlier, when we looked at the word for leavened, it comes from a word that means to leave behind or remain. And the sourdough process, you don't take all of your sourdough starter and put it into your bread. The whole process is you have to leave some behind every single batch for the next batch. You're always thinking about the next batch of bread. So looking at how their circumstances, looking at how bread is made, looking at the fact that they didn't have grocery stores to just go buy cultured yeast like we do now, if they would have gotten rid of all their sourdough starter at the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, then they don't have anything to make bread when it says later that they started up their bread process again. They've got to start from scratch and let it absorb it from the air. That can take weeks sometimes, depending on your humidity and things like that. So, like I said, the point of this is bedrock, bare minimum. If you decide to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, what are we looking at? If a family wants to go above and beyond what I'm laying out here, I don't see the harm in it. We've done that before. If anybody has done the whole spring cleaning thing coming up to Passover, where you literally tear your house apart down to the timbers, I'm exaggerating, of course, but you're looking for every single breadcrumb you can find. You're getting into the couch cushions, you're getting into the baseboards, you're maybe turning your toaster upside down and shaking it out. You're getting every single little crumb out. That bread was leavened at some point. Those crumbs that you're cleaning up around your house came from leavened bread. Even if it's saltine crackers, they have a degree of leaven in them. So when you're cleaning all that stuff out, you are removing leaven from your house. And that is the commandment, is to remove leaven from your house. But my position is that just a process-wise, that could have excluded sourdough. So because sourdough is not risen bread that you're going to be eating, because you're not supposed to eat anything with leaven in it. Nobody's eating their sourdough starter, as is anyway. So we mentioned earlier that we're removing the leaven from our house. That word remove is Strong's H7673, and it is the root word for Shabbat. So what do we do on Shabbat? We rest. We cease. Yahweh kept the very first Sabbath. He ceased from all the work he had done. He stopped, okay? So that word for remove, it doesn't necessarily mean remove like take away. It means stop. So whatever this leavening process is, you're not physically removing it from one space over into another space. There's a process involved, like our work week. We're working 6 days, and then on the seventh day, we stop working. We don't go somewhere else to a different location. We're just ceasing what we've been doing. So thinking about this process here, you can take a sourdough starter and cease feeding it. You can stop feeding it, and it will go dormant for a period of time. And when it's in that dormant phase, you're not able to use it to make leavened bread because it's not fermenting. So the most practical way that I think that this would work is they just stop feeding their sourdough starter. And they put it aside, and they're not using it during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Any bread that they make during the Feast of Unleavened Bread is going to be unleavened because A, they're not giving it enough time to pull in things from the atmosphere, and B, they're not intentionally putting sourdough starter into it. So everything they're eating by default is going to be unleavened. And then when the Feast of Unleavened Bread is over, they've still got this sourdough starter that they set aside. They kind of put it out of their sight. They stop feeding it so it's not growing or whatever. They reactivate it, and then they don't have to deal with mourning the loss of a prized family member that they've been taking care of for how many years. Like, sourdough can go on for generations. Like, Shauna's told me stories of sourdough starters that are like 4th generation on, like going back to great-grandma, great-great-grandma, the same one. And it's like a family heirloom, And, I mean, it's a valuable thing. Let's go to Leviticus 23. We have to go to Leviticus 23. And I'm covering all the scriptures that really talk about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and there aren't that many. But like I said, I'm trying to get into like bare minimum. If you choose to do this, what does it look like? So Leviticus 23, we'll read 1 through 8. Yahweh spoke again to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, Yahweh's appointed times, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these." And he starts off with the Sabbath. "For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh in all your dwellings." So you're ceasing from your work. "These are the appointed times of Yahweh, holy convocations which you shall proclaim at the times appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is Yahweh's Passover." Sidebar, does it say the Passover of the Jews? This is Yahweh's Passover. Then on the 15th day of the same month, there is the Feast of Unleavened Bread to Yahweh. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. But for 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to Yahweh. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. And so I just want to pause right there. That's kind of it. So we talked about the actual bread product itself. My position is bare minimum, if your family chooses to let your sourdough starter go dormant, put it in the fridge, put it off to the side, you're not baking with it, you're covered. If you want to go above and beyond that, I don't see any prohibitions on that. I don't see any prohibitions on if you want to get rid of it altogether. I've known people who brew beer, and during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they will get rid of all of their beer products. Even if they were making a batch and it's not quite done yet, they'll throw it out and start over. You can put beer in bread, I guess, to get it. It is pretty tasty. I've had beer bread before, but typically, I don't see the ancient Egyptians or the Israelites really using beer as a fermenter for their bread. I mean, maybe they did. We know they made beer. But anyway, so if you want to go above and beyond and just get every single bread product out of your house, I don't see any prohibition on that. I just think if we're looking at a scale going from absolute requirement, bare minimum, you need to have your sourdough go dormant until after the feast and not bake with it. If you want to go above and beyond that, that's fine. And then when we look at the rest of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we have 2 Sabbaths. We have the first day and the 7th day. And these are supposed to be holy convocations like a weekly Sabbath. And the idea is if you have a job, you take off work that day. You have a holy convocation, which we've got some scheduled. They're up in the group, but if you need to schedule for that, let us know. But the idea is that it's a 7-day thing, and everybody's there for the feast because at least the men, you're required to come up to wherever Yahweh puts His name 3 times in a year, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Shavuot or Pentecost, and at the Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkot. So you've got all these people here for 7 days, and during that whole time, everybody's united in the fact that they're having these holy convocations, and nobody's eating leavened bread. Now, I will say, I just have to confess here and hopefully set an example. If you eat leavened bread by mistake during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you don't get struck down by lightning. Ask me how I know. I have yet to be struck down by lightning. Now, I have not eaten leavened bread on purpose during the feast, but I've done it a few times by mistake. I remember, I see some agreement. The very first time I did it, I was back in 2005 is when I first started keeping the feast. I went into a bank, I forget why I was there, and they had cookies out on the counter. And I just absentmindedly reach over and grab this delicious looking peanut butter cookie. And I thought about it an hour later, and I was like, oh no, I blew it. And it was day 2 of the feast, my very first Feast of Unleavened Bread, and I had already blown it. And it's happened a few times, since then. You just kind of, but it forces you to kind of think more diligent, and I think it's Ecclesiastes 7. I don't remember the exact address, but paraphrasing, it basically says, there's not a righteous man on earth who does good continually and never sins. So, and I take a lot of encouragement because people like to highlight that the feasts of Yahweh are rehearsals. They are memorials. That's what the kind of word Moedim, or Hag kind of gets into. It's this idea of we're repeating these things. And the idea is they remind us of what they're supposed to represent and what they're pointing to, but they also give us second and third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh chances if we don't get it right that first or second or third or however many times. So if you're new to keeping the feast, whether it's year 1, whether it's year 3, if you're an old timer that's in year 20, you're going to make mistakes, and it's okay. Now, obviously, we don't want to be flippant about it and say, oh, well, I messed up. That's the wrong attitude to have, I think. We want to honor the holiness of these days, but it's not the end of the world if you trip up and accidentally have a cookie. Obviously, we'll do better next time. We just get back up on the horse. So for some principles of this, we're going to go over into the New Testament, and we're going to see I'm not going to get too theological in this, but I am going to show some basic principles. We're going to go to Matthew 13:33. And in my way of thinking, this parallels what we just read back in Genesis 18. So Sarah takes the 3 measures of flour and she makes this unleavened bread. The only other place in Scripture that it talks about a woman taking 3 measures, whether it's pecks or omers or whatever that measure is, and making bread is here in Matthew 13. So Matthew 13:33. He spoke another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 pecks of flour until it was all leavened. So now we're going to get into the idea here, like what does leaven represent spiritually? And pretty much my whole life, everyone said leaven represents sin. We've got the scripture that says knowledge puffs up, pride puffs up, these kinds of things. And we know that leaven puffs up. So it's really easy to kind of connect those 2 ideas and say leaven is kind of a representation of sin. And so when Passover unleavened bread comes around, the physical act of removing leaven from our houses is a reflection of the spiritual act of removing sin from our lives. I have zero problem with that interpretation. I just think that it's bigger than that. So right here, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. So if leaven represents sin, how do I reconcile that with the kingdom of heaven being like leaven? I think what he's talking about here, the woman, she takes it and she hides it in 3 pecks of flour until all was leavened. And we're going to see here in a minute that leaven, out of the Messiah's own mouth, represents doctrine or teaching. And so the idea here, the kingdom of heaven starts off unleavened. This woman places leaven into it, and over the course of time, the whole thing becomes leavened. Now, when a loaf of bread fully becomes leavened, you can't take the leaven out of it. You can't put more into it because it's cooked and everything. You can't add leaven. It's basically maximized its full potential for leavenness, I guess, to coin a new word. So I think that this is the Messiah saying that the kingdom starts off with a small amount of input, with a small amount of teaching. And we see this I'm not big into the idea of progressive revelation. I think that idea kind of gets contorted by some people, and I see where they're going with it, but the idea that you start off with less information in Genesis, and as you go through to Revelation, you're kind of gradually adding more information, more revelation, and you get a fuller picture of what's going on. And I think it's like that. You start off with no leaven, no doctrine, no teaching, and over the course of time, the teaching of the kingdom has fully permeated the kingdom. It's gone everywhere it possibly can, and now that bread is done. Let's get it out of the oven and enjoy. So Matthew 16, we'll go a couple pages over. We're going to read verses 1 through 12. Matthew 16, 1 through 12. The Pharisees who did believe in the resurrection, and the Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. That's not in the text. I added that. It's a homeschool thing, I guess. They came up and testing Yahshua, they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied to them, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given it, except the sign of Jonah. And he left them and went away. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. We're talking physical bread here. And Yahshua said to them, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They began to discuss this among themselves, saying, he said that because we did not bring any bread. But Yahshua, aware of this, said, you men of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves that you have no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets full you picked up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets full you picked up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so if we think about the process of leavening, it's really easy to just put your bread out and just let it absorb whatever leavening is ambient in the room. You can almost think of it like as a form of osmosis. There's a scripture that talks about how how bad morals ruin good morals. It's so important to be careful who we're around and who is influencing us because, especially you youngsters, it's really easy to absorb influences and teachings and doctrines from people around that are not good for your loaf of bread, so to speak. We want to end up with, like, if we're presented as a living sacrifice, like the scriptures say, you can sacrifice bread, right? Not leavened bread, but you can sacrifice bread. You want that to be the best specimen possible. And so we want to be really careful the teachings that we absorb, and it's the Wild West out there. There's everybody in their literally, there are channels. I showed the kids one last night of people putting their dogs on webcams on YouTube and it getting 4,000 views. Literally anybody can go on social media and teach anything they want. And so we have to be so careful of what we're exposing ourselves to. And he's talking about like actual people who were seasoned teachers, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These were people with training, and he's basically saying, if you allow yourself to absorb that, it can be detrimental to you. But it's clear that he's talking about teaching. He's not talking about sin per se. Let's go over to Mark 8. Mark 8, we'll read verses 1 through 21, similar idea. Mark 8, 1 through 21. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Yahshua called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. And his disciples answered him, where will anyone be able to find enough bread here in this desolate place to satisfy these people? And he was asking them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves, he gave thanks and broke them, and started giving them to his disciples to serve them, and they served them to the people. Now, I just want to pause right here. Knowing that leaven represents doctrine or teaching, to me, we're kind of seeing discipleship here. He's giving this bread to his disciples, and his disciples are the ones passing it around. And as we're going to read here, as this happens, this bread is multiplying. That's the whole idea of discipleship. It's coming from one person down to the next person, down to the next person. And if that process continues, you end up with this exponential growth by powers and factors of tens or hundreds. It's not just linear. Okay, so verse 7. They also had a few small fish, and after he had blessed them, he ordered these to be served as well. And they ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 7 large baskets full of what was left over of the broken pieces. About 4,000 were there, and he sent them away. And immediately he entered the boat with his disciples and came to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came out and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. Sighing deeply in his spirit, he said, why does this generation seek for a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. Leaving them, he again embarked and went away to the other side. And they had forgotten to take bread, and did not have more than 1 loaf in the boat with them. They're not very fast learners, it seems like. But we would do so much better in modern times, right? We're so much more spiritual than they were. And he was giving orders to them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. So he's throwing Herod in there too. And for anyone who's not familiar with Herod, Herod was an Idumean. The Idumeans generally accepted were basically Esau, Edom. And, Idumea, Edom, it's similar. But he was basically in a position where he was a non-Israelite. He was a Gentile. But to appease the crowds, because he didn't want riots and things like this, he sort of had to kind of meet them in the middle. So Herod was doing some of this Jewish stuff, but he wasn't worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he was basically kind of sort of half assimilated with them, but for political reasons. And, in today's day and age, especially with politics being such a huge part of the public debate, it's really easy to let politics, the leaven of politics, influence our faith. There's kind of a joke among, certain people, that I remember my parents talking about it, GOP, the Republicans. Well, that's the grand old party, right? But I've also heard people call it God's own party, because Republicans, by and large, typically tend to be Christians. They tend to be more conservative with their faith, pro-life, anti-abortion, things like this. And so, but the idea is that when we couple politics with our faith, it's really easy for one to contaminate the other, and not in a good way. And so I think that's kind of why he's throwing Herod in here. Like, be careful that politics doesn't influence your faith, because politics has doctrine, it has teaching just as much as our faith does. I guess I should finish that out here. Let's see. Where was I here? Oh, verse 16. They began to discuss with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Joshua, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you discuss the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet see or understand? Do you have a hardened heart? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves of the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces you picked up?" They said to him, 12. "When I broke the 7 for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up?" And they said to him, 7. And he was saying to them, "Do you not yet understand?" So they clearly don't get this. You know, he's been saying this over and over again. He's using bread, literal bread, to teach them stuff, and they're not getting it. But he's basically saying, be aware of teaching. Let's go to Luke 12, a few pages over. We're just going to read verses 1 through 3. Same kind of idea. Luke 12, 1 through 3. Under these circumstances, after so many thousands of people had gathered together that they were stepping on one another, he began saying to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. But there is nothing covered up that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. Accordingly, whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered in the inner rooms will be proclaimed upon the housetops. And so, again, he's talking about the leaven of the Pharisees, and he calls it hypocrisy. And it reminds me of the scripture where he talks about when they sit on the seat of Moses, do what they say, but otherwise don't do what they do. It's this whole idea, like, if they're on the seat of Moses, presumably they're reading from the Torah. They're reading the words of Moses. Do that stuff. But when they talk away from the seat of Moses, that's when they're getting their own traditions and their own doctrine, their own leaven in. Don't listen to that stuff, you know? And I would say, like, you know, the idea of having discernment, in theory, would allow you to kind of, like, you know, use some wisdom and kind of pick apart, you know, where their teachings, even if it's not directly verbatim from Moses, does it conflict with Moses, or does it add to or take away from the word? But it's far easier just to keep it simple and just stick with Moses, you know, and just save yourself the headache. But it's this whole idea here with leaven, there's nothing covered up that will not be revealed. Okay, so whatever this is, this hypocrisy starts off hidden, but eventually it's revealed. There's a process of revelation here. He's getting back into this process language here. And there's nothing hidden that will not be known. So, you know, if something's hidden, nobody can see it. But eventually that gets revealed and people can see it. There's a process here. So we'll close with one more scripture. We're going to read 1 Corinthians chapter 5, the whole chapter. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. It is actually reported that there is immorality among you, and immorality as such kind. Now this is interesting because he's going to talk about the Gentiles here in a minute. There's immorality among you, and immorality as such a kind as does not exist even among the Gentiles, that someone has his father's wife. So I just want to stop right there. We know the idea of Romans 11, that when you become a believer, you are grafted into Israel. There is no Gentile tree. Like we know from the New Covenant in Jeremiah 31, it's made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not with the house of the Gentiles. So if you want to be a part of this, you have to come into Israel. You have to become, you have to come under the God of Israel. You don't get to just remain a Gentile. And he's talking to the assembly in Corinth. This is right in Gentile Central. But he's comparing them to the Gentiles, which makes the point that these are not Gentiles. Maybe biologically they are. Maybe they don't have a single bit of Jewish or Hebrew DNA in their bodies, but he's comparing them to Gentiles, which means spiritually they are not Gentiles. I think that's really important to highlight. Verse 2, you have become arrogant and have not mourned instead, so that one who had done this deed would be removed from your midst. For I, on my part, though absent in body but present in spirit, have already judged him who has so committed this as though I were present. In the name of our Master Yahshua, when you are assembled, and I with you in spirit, with the power of our Master Yahshua, I have decided to deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of his flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Master Yahshua. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? And like I mentioned earlier, this can be the natural process of air accumulation, or it can be intentional adding of a sourdough starter. Either way, once that process begins, it keeps going until it exhausts its resources or until something changes it. Maybe the temperature gets too cold or who knows. But it keeps going until it can't go anymore. Verse 7, clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Now, this is interesting. I mentioned earlier that once you add leaven to bread, you can't just take it out. So once it absorbs yeast in from the atmosphere, or once you add that sourdough starter, once that process has begun, you can't just go in and take that yeast out of the bread. The process has already begun. You either get all of the bread or you get none of the bread. But yet here he is telling us to take the old leaven out so that we can be a new lump. And this makes sense if we're talking about teaching, if we're talking about doctrine. Because, the fact that most of us used to worship on Sunday and then now we keep the Sabbath. Or we used to just eat anything that was on the buffet table and now we're more diligent to eat clean. Different things like this. It's the idea that you have doctrines and you have teachings and you're removing those. And you're making yourself into a new piece of bread. We can't do that with literal leaven, with literal yeast, but we can do that with doctrine and teaching. Verse 8, therefore, let us celebrate the feast. I love this. And what was the last feast he just mentioned? Did he mention Christmas? Did he mention Easter? The last feast he mentioned was Passover. But Paul said to celebrate the feast of Passover. Point blank, full stop. I love it. Okay, so therefore let us celebrate the feast, which I plan on doing this year. It's going to be awesome. Not with old leaven, old doctrine, old teaching, nor with the leaven of malice, the doctrine, the teaching of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I wrote you in my letter not to associate with immoral people. I did not at all mean with the immoral people of the world, or with the covetous and swindlers, or with idolaters, for then you would have to go out of the world. So he's talking about in-house. He's talking about immoral people in-house. He's not saying, like in modern times, it's easy to look out in the world and say, yeah, we don't want to be a part of that. But we got to be really careful that we don't let that in the camp. I think that's what he's talking about here. But actually, I wrote to you not to associate with any so-called brother if he is an immoral person, or covetous, or an idolater, or a reviler, or a drunkard, or a swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Do you not judge those who are within the assembly? But those who are outside, Elohim judges. Remove the wicked man from among yourselves. And this is where I mentioned influence. All it takes is one bad influence in a group of people, and it can be anything. Under the right conditions, that can take off and it can spread through the group, and next thing you know, your group is completely overtaken or defunct or split up or hijacked or whatever it is. It's super easy for this to happen. And this is why we have to be so diligent. I like to point out, and I didn't always see this, but when we frame things, like if we go to the book of Revelation, it starts off with the revelation of Yahshua the Messiah. But everybody reads it, myself included over the years, as the revelation of the beast or the revelation of the Antichrist. What are we looking for? We're using that book to identify what we're looking for out in the world. The point of that book is to identify Messiah. It's kind of a compare and contrast kind of thing. And it's really easy to fall into these traps where we frame something a certain way and we let that influence our doctrine. Like when you start looking for Messiah in biblical prophecy, that's a completely different paradigm than looking for the Antichrist in biblical prophecy. And this is a guy who spent literally decades doing the latter. Like Shauna can attest, hours and hours every night. I'd come home Friday night from work sometimes, and I'd be up until 2 or 3 in the morning going through Daniel, Revelation, trying to literally identify who the Antichrist was, who is the beast, all this kind of stuff. I'm spending all my time focusing on him, and I'm not spending that time focusing on the one who bought me with his blood. And that's huge. And because I was influenced by people around me, like I was influenced by people that I fellowshiped with. I was, obviously on social media and things like this. And like from my own personal background, the book of Daniel and Revelation is what got me into Torah, because I started to see that, like, when I was brought up in the church I was brought up in, they were preterists. So all prophecy's already been fulfilled. And so the idea was, well, we don't need to read Revelation. What's the point? Other than the letters to the churches, right? That's valuable. But we don't need to know about the beast or anything like that. That already happened. Daniel and the beast in Daniel and that kind of stuff, it's irrelevant. It's already happened, right? And so when I started to realize that that wasn't necessarily true, that prompted me to read my whole Bible cover to cover and say, okay, what else was I wrong about? Because I was onboarding teaching and doctrine from other people that I hadn't taken the time to really make sure lined up with Scripture. And so when I started to see that, oh, Yahweh was the first Sabbath keeper and he wasn't Jewish, how radical is that, right? When I started to see, oh, wait, what's this forever word attached to Sabbath? Wait a minute, what? Forever ended at Calvary? That doesn't make sense, and it just kind of snowballs like it does for so many people. And so I was able to go through the process like we do of taking that old leaven, that old doctrine and teaching out, and replacing it with better leaven, better teaching, what I think is the actual leaven of the kingdom, And so I think it's so important. And so, like, the purpose of today, hopefully I conveyed it properly, but it's practically, if you're going to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, what does it look like as far as like the bakery aspect of it, the actual bread aspect of it, the functional, how we keep the holy days? It's pretty straightforward. It's not a huge deal, but yet spiritually it's very important because of what it represents. And then when we get into like the actual spiritual meaning of leaven, we can't remove sin. This is what cracks me up. Every year, our Catholic friends, they do Lent, and they will remove some kind of sin from their life for 40 days. Why not just remove it from your life forever? You know what I mean? Like why just take a pause for 40 days and then get right back to whatever your sin was? And some in the Hebrew Roots Torah thing, and this may be controversial, but I've known people over the years who have done this. When we get up to the Feast of Trumpets, those 10 days leading up to the Day of Atonement, they'll do something similar. They'll start repenting. They'll start looking for sin. It's like, wait a minute, 10 days out of the year, we're removing sin from our lives, and then, after the Day of Atonement, we're going to get right back to it? Like, no. Why don't we just put in the work to just remove sin from our lives the best we can, 24/7, 365? And I think that's the point. That's the whole idea. As long as we have that old leaven in us, we're going to keep going back to those old ways, and we're going to keep making excuses to bring that sin back into our lives, because doctrine and teaching do lead to sin, if they're allowed to. Anyway, I guess I'll close with that. Hopefully that made sense. Hopefully it wasn't too controversial. I know that occasionally when I do a teaching, I go into it thinking like, people might be a little squeamish when I talk about sourdough during unleavened bread, and you guys surprise me. So I'll open the floor at this point for any questions, comments.